Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining this session. So we're going to talk a little bit about web frameworks today, and in particular, the challenges of bringing a native experience onto the web. What does that mean? What are the different options out there? What are people struggling with, and so on? And as we've seen already a couple of times, we've been quite engaged with open source frameworks across the community and working really strong in particular with the likes of Sencha, Dojo, jQuery, and the Cordova community. So really what gives me great pleasure today is that except for Tim, who is busy on a press thing, there is a conflict of scheduling. He'll join in within a few minutes. But I have some esteemed guests coming in today to talk about this panel. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and then they're going to talk amongst themselves and bring up a bunch of things. So why don't you guys just introduce yourself? Edmund.
So I'm a product manager for Sencha. I manage all the frameworks that Sencha has. Sencha is a tools and framework company who provides solutions for building HTML5 applications.
Sure. I'm Michael Brooks. I'm a software developer on PhoneGap, also Apache Cordova, which is the Apache version, essentially the engine of PhoneGap that other distributions can use. Previously, I worked at a company called Nitobi. That's the company that originally created PhoneGap. Since then, we've been bought by Adobe, where we're paid full-time to commit to Apache Cordova and also to continue to work on PhoneGap.
I am Mike Hostetler. I'm the founder and CEO of Append2. We're a professional services firm formed out of the jQuery project by former members of the jQuery project. We primarily work with companies to implement and build out HTML5 applications. We do HTML5, JavaScript, and jQuery training. And we also work very closely with the jQuery mobile project and helping companies adopt and transform jQuery mobile to fit their needs. So very familiar with the technical bits of it as well.
And Tim Neal, who's going to join us in 5-10 minutes, is a director within RIM responsible for overall product management around the tooling and web and native and so on. And in particular, has been the creator of BBUI, which is that experimental projects we have on GitHub that allows people to build native-looking BB10 applications. Whoa. Okay. Let's get started. So the first topic I really wanted to bring up, I think it's the meatiest of topic, is what does it mean to be native UX on the web, right? I mean, is it kind of contrary, paradoxical with talking about the open web? And really, how do you find the balance between you want an application, you want an experience, right, an identity in the application across multiple platforms, yet you want that application to actually fit on each of the platforms and adopt its UX, right, its user experience. So we have a lot of experience here on the panel of people who've been doing this, who've been building web frameworks and trying to mimic or adopt a native user experience paradigm. So Edmund, why don't you start?
Right, so I think from our point of view, there are one way for this is really we provide on our framework a theming capability. So basically the different theme can fit into a different native UI paradigm. So we did have to work for you. The other side of it is sometimes you might also want to look at whether you want your app to be the native UI or you want the app to be your application UI too. So that's a decision point you have to make as an application developer.
Do we have data from Sencha about people who've adopted a common theme across all the platforms versus people who are targeting different themes for different platforms?
They are changing. So I think when we started off the framework with a lot of iOS focus, obviously people kind of moved the iOS theme over to Android. But now I think with a lot more platform coming up, people are asking for more targeted themed applications, but it really also depends on your real applications. If you are like a photo browsing applications, maybe you don't need to have different themes, but if you are specific applications that bring out a lot of like date pickers or other more native-like control, then you might want to use a native theme. So then people are used to that particular user experience.
I think it's important to distinguish how you're delivering that web content. So open web, that makes me think of a hosted application out on the web accessible through a URL. And in that case, it's very rare that you're delivered an application that matches your operating system. You don't, I've said this over and over, but you don't hit a website and have an app look like your Mac or your Windows or GNOME on Linux or something like that. It doesn't happen. And people just haven't made that connection with mobile devices yet. So once in a while you see someone trying to theme it like iOS. And it works great if you're on iOS, but if you hit it with any other device, it looks silly. It looks really, it's almost insulting to the user. But on the other side, Sencha, their entire product is about theming for an OS. And it works incredibly well for local web applications. So in this case, PhoneGap applications, or WebWorks for BlackBerry, where you've built an application using web technologies, but you're offering it as an installable application that runs as a quote-unquote native application. And in that case, it's really important. You should match the conventions, the guidelines of that particular platform. Appearance is up in the air. Like, it's up to you. Like he mentioned, if you're using a photo app or a video game, you have more liberty inside of what to do with the OS or with the UI. But if you're doing something very standard, you may want to adhere to those conventions.
Yeah, I think it's important because people, when they see, internet users have been trained for over a decade now to expect the web to work anywhere. The web is the web, right? You access it through a Mac or a PC, it doesn't matter. It roughly looks the same. They don't, typical users don't experience the pain we feel when, the minute pixel differences when comparing this stuff. So we have to understand, I think there's a couple sides to this. You got to understand kind of who your target is, because a line of business application, data-driven, lots of tables, buttons, entry fields, that sort of thing, I think is much more appropriate to be targeted or maybe themed a little bit closer to the OS that you're targeting via multiple themes. But that's because the interface doesn't vary much. Right? It needs to be consistent. That's a goal to make the piece of software efficient. Versus, an Instagram or a photo app, where the creativity, the user experience of those applications is a key piece of what's being delivered. Right? Instagram, as an example, is a very sort of visually rich application, and I've seen different experiments where people really push the boundaries of CSS3 on mobile to make like radial spinners and some cool stuff like that. So I think you really, when you get into this, you have to understand the different segments. You have to really know who you're targeting. And it's really been cool because the platforms as a whole have technically sort of satisfied both, right? They allow you the capabilities in their native browser, sort of mobile Safari or mobile WebKit browsers to do very cool things, right? CSS3 is very well supported, so you can really push your themes to get close, or you can go sort of the jQuery mobile route, which rather than targeting its base theme towards any platform, chose sort of the generic route. There's the jQuery mobile theme. It's a web theme that if you do want to go that route, if that's appropriate, you can hit all the different devices, have a very similar user experience. But again, that theme structure is very rich. So the jQuery mobile theme that RIM put out, it builds on top of that structure, right? So in the structure of a jQuery mobile app, you can really choose in how you want to construct it. So I think there's a lot of flexibility, and for us, really in the real world, we've seen it come down to what are you targeting, and what is the most appropriate choice for what you're building.
So there's types of applications, and there is whether you are, it's really about the brand identity. If you're creating a brand identity across multiple platforms, you want to retain your experience, right? And if you're doing enterprise is a good space where it's forms, it's workflow, and those types of things, you want them to merge with the native experience of the device.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I go back to your question. I don't think it's contrary to the open web. I think native UX has a great place because it's fast, it's known, it's efficient, and for users, buying into a specific brand, it's a very important component where they feel at home, whether they're in a web app, sort of delivered in a native wrapper or in a native app. And that consistency can be very, very important.
Cool.
So
I mean, when we talk about that consistency, right, the web technology has performance and feature challenges. And it's really the job of the framework makers to overcome that and do pretty much most of the work for you guys, right? So what are examples within Sencha, within the jQuery mobile theme that we built, examples where performance was really an issue across different platforms, and how did we get around it? Or are there features that are native features? Hey, Tim, just come and sit there.
You're on the podium.
And particular features that were just difficult, that do fit better in a native kind of environment versus the web. So like very kind of stories of experience, of challenges, of overcoming those things.
Right, on this on the Sencha framework, I think one key thing that we really worked very hard on every platform is actually the scrolling performance. I mean, iOS browser is pretty nice, so the scrolling capability is really good, smooth that way. Android, we ran into a lot of issues initially, and we actually have a targeted Android solutions, so that and different versions of Android solutions to make sure touch runs well with the scrolling. So it is the framework capability that makes the performance show up correctly, and then we're currently working on the BlackBerry theme, so then making sure all the BlackBerry stuff are also scrolling correctly. I mean, just as simple as scrolling is already an issue, but we take a look at it at different ideas on how we actually smooth out the scrolling. We actually have some timing controls in our Android stuff, specifically targeting Android browsers, so then they actually show as smooth as any other devices. That's just a key example. So.
Yeah, we've got tons in PhoneGap. Basically, with the idea of PhoneGap is that we can override any of the browser features with a native implementation. And when I worked at Nitobi, we made money through consultancy. We built apps for other people, and we often hit hurdles. File I/O was a huge one. Modern browsers have, well, at least Google's modern browser has file access, but the older ones don't. And even with the Google browser, it's often better just to use File I/O on the native side. Older BlackBerries, BlackBerry 5 and 6, a native implementation to fetch remote resources and download them is sometimes faster than using XHR, which sounds absurd, but when you hit megabytes and megabytes of files, it actually can pay off. You can also have pretty good threading on the native side, whereas you're often limited on the XHR account. We've overrode geolocation in the browser with our own native because it performs faster, it offers much more detail, higher accuracy. With that, though, comes memory costs. Also, your application is consuming more memory as a result. I can go on and on, I think, for like various bits, but the general consensus that we've had is when you're building an application, performance is the most important thing. Far more important than eye candy. You have to have a well-performing application. Mm-hmm. So even if a browser supports the ability to round corners through CSS, certain Android devices, especially 2, has a huge performance hit around that, massive performance hit. The interaction becomes very laggy. And square corners with fast performance or an image for the rounded corners, if you really need it, it's a much better solution. So always veer on performance over beauty in your application.
Yeah. I mean, at jQuery Mobile, the biggest one that comes to mind was the page transitions, right? I mean, they make heavy use of CSS3, and even though they sort of have a default that they fall back to on older browsers, that really slowed things down. And it's not so much about the technical slowdown, but it's the feel, right? Is what you were
That's
saying.
the key, actually. It's about perception, about
Yeah.
feeling. You can take a long time to load something, but do it smartly.
If it feels sluggish, your users won't adopt it, whether the browser supports it or not. I mean, the key that we've found in building our apps is optimize for that experience. And because when you're going and building something with these frameworks and you're trying to mimic and live up to the expectations of that native experience, you really have to pay attention to the friction points in your app. So
Instagram has an incredible blog article around that, about
really?
loading assets. If you're viewing images in their viewer, it only downloads the image that's currently on your screen, and it'll try to pause that download if you scroll it off the screen. And it's just smart loading, really.
Yeah.
They're not wasting cycles. They don't want to download images that you won't see. You're wasting bandwidth. You're slowing down, scrolling, that kind of thing. So.
I mean, I think I'd be neglecting something too if I would. The idea behind jQuery Mobile, where it stores a lot of its configuration and structure in the DOM, was a fundamental architectural decision, because jQuery Mobile was meant to target not just the top tier of browsers, but the older browsers as well. And it does that by putting a lot of its configuration and structure in an HTML document that the browser renders. That design choice, while was very key to the project, but because of browsers having to sort of parse that and then work with it, it does have an impact. Now, modern smartphones, I mean, the BlackBerry family of devices is actually one of the best at this. They load it up and they can work with jQuery mobile apps very, very easy and very fluidly. But on your older browsers, like you were saying, Android 2,
Yep,
we have a special place in our heart for
yeah, we just dropped support for Android 2, actually.
So, Tim, I mean, we were talking about lazy loading.
Yeah, the DOM. So my two pet peeves that constantly, kind of give me a kick in the butt is DOM manipulation and animation timing. So the big things that kind of like the jQuery mobile stuff, BBUI is very, very similar in its structure, its layout, it's DOM-based. It's a personal preference of mine, and it's why I did a lot of authoring that way, is that I like manipulating the DOM. The problem is you need to be able to do that stuff off DOM to be able to make it fast, right? Because what happens is, especially for being able to create these really modern-looking UIs and crazy controls like our drop-downs that shoot things down below it or doing weird different things, is that there's a lot of styling and a lot of regeneration of new divs and DOM elements to be able to do it. So every single time you touch that live DOM and manipulate something in JavaScript, it's recomputing layout. And recomputing layout is deadly expensive inside of a browser. So being able to do your styling off DOM and then putting it into the actual document is a huge speed increase inside of your application. So that's one of the key things that we've been trying to put into BBUI. And again, with that DOM manipulation, if you're doing animations, timing your DOM manipulation before and after animations, like after it's done, it's going to make your animations much smoother. Because what happens is you're redoing and recomputing layout during the middle of an animation, and you're going to get chop and stalls and delays and these weird things going there. So manipulating the live DOM can bite you in the butt all over the place. So you have to be very careful for being able to create a very performant application, right? So I want to download a list. So I go and get a list, and I'm going to get 200 items off there. I'm going to generate them item by item and stick them into the DOM. Then I'm going to go ask a toolkit to go and style them all, and it's going to insert more elements and style, and it just takes a lot of time. So anything that you can offload off DOM means you can also offload it in a worker thread, because you don't have to touch the DOM. You can style and do everything in a worker, and it's not doing anything while your UI is going on. Once it's done, jam it in. Yep. So these are all key things that help make that toolkit performant as you're trying to make things look really, really responsive.
Yeah, and that's the key here. And you've heard this over and over again. CSS, right, is a very critical piece of technology. right? Styling, but also powering all the animations. Most animations on mobile web are not done using JavaScript. They're really done using and exploiting hardware-accelerated properties of CSS. But when you look at theming, right? Typically, what's the theme architecture that you guys are using, right? How do you express a theme? Where does CSS become just not enough? And you have to start to supplement with JavaScript. One of the key things is starting to build custom controls. For BB10, the overflow menu, for example, was a typical example of where we had to do some extra work that just CSS styling was not able to do on its own. So kind of experience and practical things about those
We're going
CSS
to run this way?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
sure.
right.
Go for it.
So a couple different items. One is just very operating specific user controls, right? You need to do things like pushing things around and sometimes animating things. You have to, again, make that choice, right? Those drop-down buttons that we see in BlackBerry 10 and you see in Cascades and it's fluid and animated. Yeah, BBY, no, I just opened that sucker, right? Because trying to recompute and push web content down in a browser, you know, these are things where CSS isn't going to really help you a whole lot with this and actually can get in the way if you try to do animations too much. So other different things, if you look at, you know, if you're trying to get pixel perfect, you see things like colors of borders that go halfway around and just curl around the edges halfway down on a button. Well, CSS has right, left, top, and bottom, and then it stops them. And trying to be able to do things like that means you need to nest multiple divs and do different types of styling to get you the same effect. So sometimes getting the really close, accurate depiction of native stuff, you either have to layer divs and put more things in place with more CSS, or be able to do things, you know, my favorite pet peeve is there's no such thing as hover and touch anymore. So what you could do before with, you know, pseudo classes with hover to be able to change attributes and do these different things, now you have to do with touch starts and touch end events and augment those with JavaScript. So it used to be just built in that you could do all this really cool stuff, but now what does hover mean on these different browsers, and it handles it different. So those are kind of the things that I've always kind of run into.
I mean, you brought in something interesting, which I know that Sencha is particularly, you know, opinionated about, is the pixel perfectness, right? And you hold your device. If you have a magnifying lens and you look at every details, right,
Yeah.
you'll see that the web experience does not match the native experience, right? There's little gradients. I mean, it's very subtle. If you hold it at an arm's length, both side by side, you probably can't tell the difference, right? And this is finding that right balance here to maximize performance and the feeling, right? The subjective feeling of how effective the overall UX is. That is all the magic that the frameworks are pulling for you guys. You don't have to think about it.
Yeah, your user's not going to do screen caps and overlay them on top of each
Exactly.
other. No. That had 5 stops of gradients going across that button, and you just do 1. No, right? But you do 5 stops of gradients in CSS. Have fun animating it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then on the Sencha stack, the touch charts is pretty much probably the key example of CSS is probably not sufficient. We have a very interactive charting component, and you can basically style any color, and it's interactive that you can actually touch and change shapes of and pull in data as you go. That's just not a CSS component that we can build, but we provided that solutions not using CSS, but it's out there. I think also to add on to that, I think as long as, I think the CSS filter spec actually brings a lot of hope to a lot of these CSS changes. I mean, the things that you want to do. As long as, when that particular spec is fully adopted by every single browser and device maker, that will help this particular situation a lot more. But at this point, when not everybody is supporting filters, there's still a lot of work, especially from the framework side, that needs to compensate for the CSS side.
For PhoneGap, we're looking into adding more and more custom widgets. Pender is probably one of the best examples right now. Pender allows you to do ideally WebGL and also Canvas on devices that can't support it naturally or just run it very poorly. Android is the example there. And so we actually intercept your Canvas object. We also intercept all of your Canvas code that you write in JavaScript, and we kick up OpenGL on the device. and we can render the canvas exactly where it would be in the browser field, or we can do full screen, either one. And you get the true power of that device. It's raw WebGL. We've just found ways to embed native controls inside the browser. So Pender is one of the popular ones. We've done it with scrolling views, because scrolling is such a pain. So like 2 years ago or so, we would render list views inside the browser at certain spots so you could scroll through, and it was the native list. We've also, I think a good example is a camera application or contacts. It's very important to invoke native applications on the device in certain situations. So if your application is going to use the camera, it's a lot better to invoke the user's default camera on that device. They know what it is, they know how it works, they can snap a photo and the photo can be returned back to your app, rather than you styling your own camera theme and having to educate this user how to use it. Contacts is another one. It's extremely slow to render hundreds or thousands of contacts into the browser, as Tim touched on, like list views, rendering and styling and all that.
The endless scrolling list.
Yeah, and so it's a lot nicer just to invoke the contacts application, have it pop up, the user can pick their contact, and that information is returned back to your browser where you can then interact with it. So that's where we are today. We're looking into intercepting CSS bits. So filters would be an example. We can start to polyfill those filters and offer a rich experience on devices that can't do it right now. Adobe, yesterday, they just showed off a lot of the work that they're doing. They're contributing to WebKit and really pushing what CSS filters can do. It's pretty incredible 3D work inside of the CSS. And because we're contributing to WebKit, we're trying to get that stuff into the builds of WebKit so that they start coming down into all of these devices. But you still have to polyfill everything that's out there right now. So that's PhoneGap's job.
Yeah. It gets tricky, right? I mean, like you touched on the widgets thing. It's there's a fine line, and it's kind of a framework choice on where to draw that line. I mean, this is just one perspective, but in the jQuery perspective, there's, because of, again, the target of the framework of working as widely as possible, most of the theming is in CSS. But as you're saying, that limits what you can do. It's just been a design decision that's been made, and then it's pushed into widgets. You know, it's kind of what creates the choice, and you're able to sort of get some of that different perspective and get the right tool for the job. So.
Yeah, there's certainly different angles. Like ideally, by going a pure web route, if someone can compile it with PhoneGap and PhoneGap's managed to correctly polyfill what you guys are doing, then the two can feed off of each other. Otherwise, you can fall back on something that BlackBerry, for example, does. Like you guys have a lot more control over just the ability to inject native components into the browser field if you choose to, or invoke, such as the WebWorks ability to invoke any external application and return that content back. It's really useful.
So that BlackBerry flow and the integration across native components, right, is a key thing. So, you know, frameworks provide, this is when, like, when you build a web app, it's a combination of the framework you decide to use and something like WebWorks or Cordova. The two work in concert. And BBUI is actually a good example where BBUI only works inside WebWorks. It doesn't work on, some controls they're using are dependent on WebWorks capabilities. It wouldn't just work on a website. And so device integration, native integration is starting to become much more important. Not just for feature XYZ, but to start composing pieces of the UI, of the device experience that people are familiar with. So you've seen this morning in the keynote the concept of cards that we have, which are basically targets for content. So from the browser app, you can bring the camera or video editing or other things, pieces of functionality that exist on the device that you can then interact with in a seamless way. So that's, you know, something that in particular Cordova is very strong with. And BBUI is an interesting kind of half and half view of the world.
Yeah, it's one of the things we do, you know, polyfilling on our own operating system in the toolkit, right? I mean, it's, you know, the menu, if there's already an API there inside of WebWorks, it uses it instead of trying to draw it on the screen, right? Or, you know, pop up, you know, the drop downs that you see running on a BlackBerry 6 or 7 phone with it are actually calling out into small dialogue things that are part of WebWorks, but then when it runs in Ripple, it actually runs and emulates it, and it emulates it on Playbook to be able to get that experience. So it polyfills where it needs to and uses built-in native APIs when it can. The native API stuff is an interesting conversation on what are the right ones. Should there be all of them? Do you need all of them? Well, again, it comes back down to what the hell are you trying to build, right? If you need all of them, you need them. If you don't need them, you don't need them. If you're going cross-platform and you want to keep a common denominator and using core PhoneGap ones that have already been abstracted across these different ones, it's one of these things where there isn't a check, yep, this is what I should use, right? And this is one of the great things around web and different toolkits is that you can pick or mix and match the things that give you the different things that you need in scenarios. So I think it's really cool to see how they can actually all work in concert. And we're one of the things we're down here is trying to figure out what are those native APIs and functionalities that make sense. And some of the stuff working with guys from PhoneGap is what are things that should be down there as a cross-platform thing? What are you experiencing and seeing a cross-platform are things that should be invoked, like the contact picker and these things, versus trying to replicate it and make sure that we have it available in our platform just natively. So, it's finding out what works versus what's the prescribed best theoretical way to do things, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of interesting because in handling and building some of the apps that we've been hired to build, we've actually come up with different ways to sort of introduce architectural layers at times, very similar to how PhoneGap does, but it wasn't a full PhoneGap type application. It's sort of this idea of contracts between pieces in order to write our application, write our primary business logic to that contract, and then, depending where we're deploying it to, sort of shim it in from the background, and we handle that via a build process. Future-proof. We solved the problem that we were facing.
Yeah.
I think this is why solutions like Cordova are really cool with the architectural, the longer-term approach that you guys have taken. It's going to be very interesting to kind of see where it goes. But
and it's how fast do browsers evolve with the built-in functionality
they move so
that
quickly.
We're trying to do, right? It takes time for stuff to go. Stuff we've seen is people typically hold onto a phone for 12 to 18 months.
Yep.
Right, and so in that cycle, when it comes back in, they got a new operating system that's going to bring this new functionality. Don't know, it might, right? And will this new phone get the latest Android that's got the new stuff? Will it get upgraded? Will it not? It's kind of an odd world, but toolkits that can polyfill and do this stuff help you out a lot.
I mean, we found ourselves optimizing not so much towards what we're targeting because it changes, right? It's a moving target all the time. We're working more on our engineering practices to be able to handle that change without a lot of friction. Yeah. So it's kind of funny because we have this problem over here that we can't, we just have to live with. It's a good problem. It's a good thing that the market is figuring this out, right? We don't get into sort of the silo of the web that we did before. There's a lot of choice in how you go about building something. So rather than building towards one specific target like we were used to, we've actually found ourselves changing how we build things to just deal with it rather than trying to target and come up with a technical solution.
This is stuff that's been dealing with for tens of years in the web, right? This is no new thing, you go back to the old days of NC Mosaic versus then IE, and then IE with this and that and the other thing, and all these different browsers out there that people are choosing from choice. I mean, it's the same thing. The cool thing is that the industry and this technology has been dealing with so long that they've got methods and practices to be able to deal with the change instead of going, oh crap, what now, right? There's toolkits and stuff that can help them work in concert to make it all happen and not be a big burden.
So you're saying you don't want to bring back the built for Netscape 4 badge?
Yeah.
So I mean, part of those best practices, one thing that is one of my favorite topic internally is the conversation you and I have a lot, and we have that also with Cordova, is Some people advocate that you take a native API and you just map it, method for method, parameter for parameter into the web. And it doesn't work. There is something different about a web API versus the native API. So what's the mystery here? How do you characterize that difference?
We've found that one of the hardest parts about API is the design for the web, for cross-platform. With PhoneGap plugins, we encourage everyone to always have an error callback, and call that callback if the device can't handle your plugin. And that way, at the very least, the lowest common denominator can recover from it and deal with it. But APIs are very difficult. A simple example is menu. W3C has a menu spec. No one's ever implemented it, really. I think Chrome has an early version of it. But if you look at it, it's designed for a desktop, very much, a standard desktop menu. But you look at all the menus and devices. On an Android, you press the menu button and a menu pops up on the side. For Windows Phone 7, you press the menu button and the entire app flips over to be a different menu. BlackBerry, very similar to Android, which is quite nice, except BlackBerry supports submenus, whereas Android doesn't. And then iPhone has a small bar at the bottom, but the buttons are very limited. And it has a title bar at the top with a back button attached to it. Other devices have a hardware back button. And so just bouncing between how interactions work, how the information is displayed, some have icons, some don't, that kind of thing, you can't represent that very well with these specs right now. You have to feel it out. It takes a long time to design. Push notifications is another really difficult one that we're trying to deal with. Basically, we've got to the point where you have to specify different actions for each platform because every platform returns different information for push notifications. iPhone has badge counts and sounds and all this wonderful stuff. Android has much more information for the drop-down context. And so really, we can't find a clean overlap to have a single push notification plugin that actually offers the full experience, which goes back to what Laurent was saying. You can't map that API one-to-one because it won't work when you expand it beyond one platform.
Yeah,
And Sencha has also the ability to build desktop apps. So it's not just smaller device and tablets, but they also scale to desktops. All those core concepts become
the equivalent, basically. I think the options needs to be there, basically, because web API and native API, like we already talked about, is always one will be lagging the other. And I think the options of both being present, and I'm referring back to when we started our discussions, is what your app really, really wants to do is really key part of how you use which set of APIs.
Yeah, we always have, I agree with Michael, finding the API signature is the hardest thing. And one of the funny things that we deal with is that, the developers that are building the app on top of these frameworks are JavaScript developers. They expect things to work a certain way. The people that typically are building the extensions to get out to do native things are not JavaScript developers. And it needs to work this way. You need to expose an interface that has a pointer to a function pointer that does this and returns a list of other arrays of function pointers. And you're like, dude, no, right? So you're dealing with trying to marry two worlds that operate entirely different, right? So the stuff that we've always tried to work through is say, all right, forget about the underlying native API. What do you want this to do? Just run through your use case, and your API should match the use cases that you're trying to satisfy, and then worry about the native as plumbing. Right? And it's really tricky to get the two religions to work together to make something come together.
And I think I just wanted to reemphasize on the point you made, which is literally in the WebWorks team, when we have a new API, we spent 90+% just dealing with design. This is work on a piece of paper, figuring out what the right signatures are, what the right functionality. Implementation becomes a detail in the schedule, right? So we have to build very powerful, very generic APIs. And PhoneGap also, I always joke with PhoneGap and Cordova that you look at the contacts API, the definition of the API is actually pretty simple. And then you go through 2.5 pages of caveats, right? On Android, you do this. But if you were to build you have an application that depends on contacts. You have one use case that you care about, which is your application. It might take you a couple of hours to actually build that API, special case it for your use case, and implement the native stuff underneath the covers. So all those frameworks, Cordova is leading the way there. We're doing something similar with WebWorks. We're starting to simplify how you build and extend APIs and recognize truly that a special case API is an order of magnitude simpler to design and implement than the stuff that the Cordova team or the WebWorks team is dealing with, which is all the corner cases, all the things we can dream about that users could do, and a very large quantity of use cases at the end of the day. The difference is truly astronomical.
And I'm curious how you guys have approached security when you've done that, because I mean, one of the things that in just the pure web context, not sort of the hybrid web context, security is a huge deal.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Windows 8 is facing this right now, and how do you interact with an unsecure environment of the internet, and users have the ability to pull down and run code. I mean, third-party ads on our desktop sites are a great example of this. Google Plus that code has been a performance killer for a while, which is sort of ironic. Personal favorite example.
And this is something Tim and I have discussed for a long time, and
yeah.
we've had a lot of people internally in the company.
Yeah,
and
it's
Tim
an
and I have a simple answer, which is
it's an ongoing conversation. It's really,
but the simple answer is that once you're within a container, once your web
Right.
content starts to behave like an app, you essentially don't have more or less capabilities than you have with a native app.
Right. So the caveat here, and this is the one that's gone through, and we originally went back against the W3C spec for widgets as well around the access listing and the whitelisting and features and these different things, is that most of the specs that are out there is that, okay, I'm adding this API for my app, but it never really talks about, well, where's the origin of your content coming in from?
Yep.
So now my app has all of these feature functionality, but I've decided, I'm going to go do an AJAX request off of this and jam it in on an eval on my site. No, bad, right? So
Yeah.
it's one of these things, you have to take in mind all the things that you do to protect your website around injection. Like if someone typed in a JavaScript function into your submit form that was going to go into a comment,
Yep.
you don't want that code running, right? So you need to take these things into consideration. If you are going to take outside content and place it inside of your application, you better damn well be sure you know what's going to be coming across off of that site and
Yep.
how you're going to do it. So there's all sorts of ways to deal with this. We use Facebook buttons. They're in iframes.
Yep.
They're secure that they can't jump the boundary back and forth into being able to do these things. Being able to do things like extra with the browser windows. I forget what you guys.
Well, it's child browser.
Yeah,
But
the
we're
child
renaming
browser.
it the in-app
Sure,
browser.
there you go. The stepchild
Child
browser.
browser is a little bad name. Yeah.
So these are things, right? When you expose these APIs, you need to really think. We looked at a few different things. We're still evolving our whitelisting for BlackBerry 10 and stuff that we've learned on our existing stuff, and working with Michael and the group there. What's the right approach for this? Do you do a hard and fast rule, or and make people jump through hoops in their app, or do you find a good kind of way of doing it, but let developers understand they need to protect themselves?
Yeah.
So it's a tricky topic.
Another angle is just from the vendor side. BlackBerry being a vendor, or iPhone, or Apple, or the Android marketplace. Each one handles it differently. Apple, if they find out that you're downloading JavaScript externally and executing it inside your app to augment your app, they'll reject you or delete your app from the
Yeah.
App Store immediately, because they have no security there. You could immediately change that source you're downloading and completely change your application. You could submit a store application and immediately switch it over to something else, just under their nose. I'm not actually sure how BlackBerry deals with it at all.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious.
And Android, it's just a free market. They don't care at all. But But yeah, BlackBerry is the middle one. You guys,
Yeah.
what do you guys do?
I mean, we allow those types of applications. We've put in place like be safe first type of things
Yeah.
with signing, with whitelisting. I mean, whitelisting, we got a lot of flack about it, but whitelisting makes the security decision explicit.
Yep.
You have to enumerate the things that you trust
Right.
that you can bring in. And again, the argument is, yeah, you can't do JavaScript, but someone could build a native app that renders UI based on some weird markup and do their own parsing. And so there are
Exactly.
cases like this where, frankly, it might take a little bit more efforts to build it native, but you could still do an attack, use those attack vectors, right?
I could write a
Native app.
Python interpreter that sucks down a Python script and
Yeah.
run it locally on my device, and it does the exact same thing
Yep.
running in my environment. So there's
Yep.
no more security threat between a native and a web app on being able to expose. It's when
Right.
you're pulling in content externally and trusting it, you need to make sure that you've got this secured with an HTTPS channel, that you're bringing this across so someone can't DNS hijack you and inject stuff in the middle. It's
Yep.
all simple communication
Well,
stuff
it's the
that you
same.
need to be
It's the
aware
same.
of.
You know, defensive programming techniques we use on the web today
Exactly,
to deal
you
with
know,
security.
when you're
Exactly,
doing
but-
multiple web services and pulling in
Right.
content, it's the same security stuff, right? For RIM, we have, app signing,
Yep.
right? And the signing doesn't give you permissions, right? Your user says, I will allow this or allow that. But if your app misbehaves, we know exactly who your app is, who it's signed to, who your vendor is, and you're going to get, nailed in the store. You're going to get pulled. You're going to get yanked if you're doing and misbehaving and doing bad things, right? There's repercussions for being able to do that. So I mean, you can do bad things with any language on a smartphone. Native can go and access the contact list and go and send it off to wherever if the user said it's allowed
No,
to do it.
That's never happened.
Never happened. I've never heard of that.
Even on Apple, it's never
Yes.
happened.
Nope.
So these are things,
So-
it's you're pulling in script, it's interpreted code. You just need
Yep.
to be careful in your application where you're drawing it from.
Cool. So, I mean, we're going to go through a couple of questions now, if you have questions. But I think with this session, right, maybe some of you came in and says, okay, are they going to tell me a recipe? Should I pick framework A or B or C? And really, there's no answer, right? It's the great thing and the frustrating thing about the web. It's a little bit the Wild West. There are different options that look at the world in different ways. And you have to look at what's available and pick what best fits your needs. It's the application, there may be performance, there are cross-platform. If you want to build for fairly low-end devices and you want to have an application that runs on 30, 40 devices, a jQuery is a great solution. If you want something that is really pixel perfect and try to mimic a native UI and has very complex kind of components like charting, multimedia and so on, Sencha might be the right answer. Even if you pick those two, once you start accessing the native device, you need something like Cordova and WebWorks. So it is an ecosystem of tools. It's a world of choice that you can pick what best fits you, but you have to do your homework.
Yeah.
There's
And-
no simple answer here.
The cool part about it, though, right, is that the foundation is the same across all of it. It's the same underpinnings, the same technology. When you understand and learn web technologies, what's behind it, right, and I always see interesting posts, and wouldn't it be a wonderful world if people learned JavaScript before they learned jQuery? Because it's one of these things where when you understand the underpinnings of how this stuff works, it's really powerful, and you get to understand how each one of these frameworks sits on top of it, and whether or not it's beneficial for you and how you want to take that approach.
I mean, that's the double-edged sword. Like, how many times you and I, like, people say, "Oh, I'm going to use the web, so my app is going to write
Yeah,
itself."
it'll just
for me."
work. It'll just be
work,
awesome.
right?
It'll be
See,
cool.
The web is easy, right? And it's easier and it's richer, and there are different attributes than native, but you still have to put in your homework of figuring out what's the right implementation for your application. What are your right tools? And that will make you so much more powerful. I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience. People picking the wrong tool to build their application. Invariably, you figure it out too late.
Yep.
So please, questions, come up to the, stand up and come up to the microphone because we're recording the sessions, and line up and ask any questions you want.
Hello, this question is for Mike from jQuery. So with the implementation of jQuery, if you go to the website, it has you can use the CDN solution of downloading a minified jQuery with the style sheet and the jQuery mobile. In the foreseeable future, do you see jQuery kind of removing back support for older browsers to go more of a WebKit type solution?
Sure. So that's a couple of questions, and there's a path that jQuery core is going down, and jQuery mobile then depends on jQuery core. In jQuery 1.9, I think jQuery core 1.9 and 2.0 will be released around the same time, and jQuery has moved to a build system internally. So in 1.9, compatibility for older browsers will remain, and then 2.0 will drop compatibility and extra things for WebKit, for IE, older versions, to make a leaner, meaner version when 2.0 is launched. So I know that that's in the roadmap, and that will be coming. And then there's even functionality and things you can do in building jQuery and how you kind of piece your distribution together to further customize on that.
I mean, you can have a build of jQuery to do DOM kind of manipulation and XML HTTP requests, and a couple of functionality, and it's like 6 or 7K.
Yep.
It's like, take everything out, the whole platform now is built with a build dependency. So it's lean and mean.
Yep.
Okay.
jQuery mobile also supports a componentized build structure, but it's a little bit different. It doesn't come with dropping some of that old compatibility, because again, that was one of the design principles of the framework. So I don't know. I've not heard rumblings about whether they would maybe drop support for your older browsers. I think if they were to do that, it may not target what they would want to target. So I'm not sure.
But the desktop market worldwide is very different than the mobile market worldwide. The amplitude of old versus new on mobile is much larger than it is on desktop. So it'll move at different pace.
Okay. I have just one final second question.
Sure.
All right. I think I've touched every single technology up there. I remember seeing a blog a while back about integrating PhoneGap with Sencha Touch. Now, obviously, as Sencha has grown as well as Cordova, what would be some of the lookouts or the gotchas, I guess, things to look for when trying to remarry like Cordova with updated Cordova with like updated Sencha Touch?
So
You can touch on this.
I'll touch on the first part, and I'll add on to it. Today we still have compatible, I think the Sencha Touch is compatible with PhoneGap, even though we created our own solutions, mostly based on customer feedback, wanting to have one protocol, one vendor in the company rather than two for a particular solutions. But a lot of our customers are still using Sencha Touch with PhoneGap, and it's continuing to be working. So.
Yeah, we see lots of people using Sencha Touch, same thing with jQuery mobile. I think with Sencha Touch, you just have to deal with that device ready event, along with Sencha has a ready event, and so the only real thing to understand is you got to wait for both events before you do anything. One basically saying that the UI is up and running, the other saying that, yeah, it's okay to now communicate with native functionality for PhoneGap. A lot of people have had issues, though, with the latest Sencha. Latest being, is it 2.0? Is that what you guys are at?
We are running 2.0
or
plus 2.1 beta at the same time.
There was like an API change, a radical rewrite of Sencha Touch between 1 and 2, I think. And so the way, like tutorials describing how to marry the two together, if you're reading a tutorial for Sencha Touch 1x, it's not going to work for Sencha Touch 2x. And there's just been a lot of confusion around that. So we often see people saying, I followed this tutorial, it's not working in my PhoneGap app. And it's like, well, you're using the wrong version, is kind of the end of it. But yeah, the two should work fine. Same thing with jQuery mobile. Yep.
And it's also that those two things, again, address different. So it should work more than not work, because Sencha is really focused on the UI aspects, and Cordova is packaging and API integration. So those two are, by design, orthogonal, And where it breaks is when there's like a conflict, a weird thing around a particular API.
Yep.
Where here, I think the issue is not that it doesn't work, it's just that the tutorial is outdated.
Yeah.
That's been our experience so far, simply just misinformation.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, PhoneGap is just a browser, so
Exactly.
in the end it should just work fine.
Cool. Any more questions? Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.